There are photographs that were never meant to be seen. They sit in folders with the corners browned by breath and time. Images that make physicians avert their eyes the way one turns from a grave. The first photograph shows a newborn with a skull like a lantern, veins like black rivers beneath thin, shimmering skin. Another shows 3 small faces overlapping like drowned reflections. Men who had handled cadavers their whole lives later said, in voices stripped of bravado, that some pictures should be burned, not stored. In a hospital corridor in rural Virginia, one October morning in 1971, a woman named Sarah May Whitaker delivered something that made 3 doctors leave the room and 1 retire on the spot. What was born was not merely malformed. It was an answer written in flesh to a question nobody had the courage to ask. How far can a human line be twisted until it becomes something else entirely? Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Ask that quietly. Let the hush of your room answer. The question is a small, polite ritual. We all perform it because stories like this travel differently at night. In the thin hours, when the world feels less certain, the old hollers are louder, the mountain wind reads from old ledgers, and things that were hidden during the day step into the open. Roanoke County sits in a fold of the Appalachians, where the roads lose their names and the fog keeps out strangers. The Whitaker name first appears in the ledger of that soil in 1847. When one Joshua Whitaker filed claim to 200 acres no one else wanted. He came not for gold or cotton, but for absence. Absence of jury, absence of judge, absence of curiosity. The house Joshua raised was not built so much as grown, log upon log, rumor upon rumor, until it stood in the valley as a shape meant to hold secrets. He brought with him a household ordered by an idea that reads like a prayer with its edges burned purity. The notion was spoken aloud only rarely, always in tones meant to sound like scripture. Blood, the journals would later say, is both law and library. By the time the 20th century crept along the mountain's vertebrae, the Whitakers had closed themselves off with a diligence that felt ceremonial. They married their own. They raised children to wed brothers and cousins. What began as preference hardened into doctrine, and doctrine became a practice as meticulous as any ledger, keeping as remorseless as any plough. Neighbors learned to whisper when the Whitaker name passed their lips. Doctors stopped answering calls from that valley after 1890. But isolation does not erase consequence. It concentrates it. What is allowed to circulate only within a single bloodline grows dense and strange, like water trapped and left to steep. The Whitaker family journals, later found in a subterranean cellar, read like a breeding manual written as prayer and ledger. Men took notes with the diligence of midwives. Women recorded births and deaths with the neat, unsentimental hand of accountants tallying losses. The experiment, for no gentler word fits, folded decades inward until lines crossed themselves so often that relatives were relatives in as many ways as a tree might be leaves. The valley where the Whitakers lived was not marked on most maps. Old surveyors left the land blank, shading it with a suggestion of mountains rather than detail, as if they themselves were unwilling to claim authority over it. To reach the Whitaker homestead, one had to abandon the main road at a rusted gate, then follow a path where roots curled up like knuckles, and the air smelled always of damp earth. Outsiders who wandered too far never stayed. Some spoke of strange songs drifting across the tree line, voices neither male nor female, pitched somewhere between chant and lament. Others described seeing figures standing in fields at dusk, motionless as scarecrows, but staring until the intruder felt stripped bare. whatever those wanderers saw. They did not return twice. It is in this crucible of secrecy that Sarah May Whittaker was born in 1954, in a clapboard house that had never known glass windows or electric light. Her birth was not registered until she was nearly 3, and then only because a state official had threatened to withhold the family's land claim unless records were updated. By then, she was already one of many Whittaker children. Cousins, siblings, nieces and nephews all raised together. Distinctions blurred until the words father, uncle, and brother became interchangeable. Those who lived in the nearest town, nearly 30 miles away, had long ceased to ask about Whittaker births. It was an unspoken covenant. The family kept to their holler, and the town pretended they did not exist. The last midwife willing to serve them, an old woman named Hester Colburn, retired in 1932 after delivering a child with no recognizable mouth. Just a smooth seam where lips should have been. She told the sheriff then that she had heard a whisper during that birth. Not from the mother, but from the newborn itself. A sound like teeth clicking together in the dark. She never set foot in the valley again. By the time Sarah May reached adulthood, the Whittaker doctrine of blood purity had calcified into ritual. There were ceremonies at planting and harvest, not Christian prayers but older chants, spoken in a dialect no outsider could understand. Men carried torches into the woods and returned at dawn, silent, their faces streaked with soot. Children were taught not to ask questions, but to accept the order of things, that the circle must be kept unbroken, that new life must always draw from the old. Sarah May was quiet, with the pale eyes of her grandmother, and a thinness that seemed less the result of hunger than of something wasting her from within. She had already endured pregnancies, losses the family called offerings, but in the winter of 1971, when her belly began to swell again, the elders whispered that this child would be different. They said her womb carried the culmination, the perfection promised by their ancestor Joshua more than a century before. What Sarah May felt inside her body, however, was not perfection. It was pressure. It was fire. She told her sister one night that it felt as though the baby is making me into a room it wants to live in forever. Her voice cracked when she said it, because even then she knew her body would not survive what was growing inside her. By the 7th month, Sarah May's condition had ceased to resemble any ordinary pregnancy. Her abdomen swelled beyond recognition. The skin stretched so thin it shone like wet paper, veins dark as ink spidered beneath the surface, shifting in ways that suggested not blood flowing, but something alive pressing outward. Her hair, once the brittle blonde typical of her kin, came loose in handfuls. Her gums bled when she tried to eat. She vomited water. The elders gathered nightly at her bedside, not in pity, but in reverence. They whispered that the blood was purifying her, reshaping her for the birth of something divine. The journal of her grandfather, a ledger of names and pairings, births and deaths, recorded her symptoms without emotion, hair falling, teeth loose, eyes gone pale yellow, skin thin to glass, movements inside constant. In the margin, a notee. This is it. The circle closes. At night, Sarah May's body pulsed with rhythms the family mistook for sacred signs. To her, they felt like waves of heat and sound rolling through her bones. The child within did not kick or stretch like other infants she had carried. Instead, it shifted in rolling pulses that made her belly ripple as though struck by lightning beneath the skin. Her sister, the one she trusted most, later told an investigator that she had seen patterns on Sarah May's stomach at night. Dark geometric shapes rising and fading. Like symbols written from within, the family was ecstatic. They decorated the birthing room with relics carried down through generations, twisted branches bound in cord, stones painted with spirals, photographs of deformed infants carefully framed in black cloth. They burned herbs in cracked jars and sang in the guttural dialect they believed only they remembered. Sarah May, drifting in and out of delirium, begged them to take her to a hospital. Her pleas were ignored, treated as blasphemy against the purity of their blood. But as her condition worsened, even the elders began to sense the danger. She lost 40 pounds in as many days, her body consuming itself while the child within seemed only to grow stronger. Her skin turned waxen, her pulse erratic. Worst of all were her eyes, once brown. They became sickly yellow, and in dim light they seemed to reflect, faintly, as though lit from behind. Her uncle, father, one of several men who claimed her pregnancy as a mark of pride, declared this proof she was transforming, becoming a vessel worthy of their culmination. In truth, she was dying. By the time labor began, Sarah May had already slipped into unconsciousness, her body convulsed, ribs fracturing under the strain. The family, panicked at the thought of losing not only her, but the promised child, carried her through 30 miles of back roads to the small hospital in town. They believed the doctors there would record the event, preserve it for history, and witness the arrival of something beyond human. None of them realized what those doctors would actually see. When Sarah May was carried into Mercy General Hospital in the early hours of October 13th, 1971, she was already half dead. Her skin clung to bone, her lips cracked and bloodless, her hair scattered across the pillow like shed husks. Yet her belly, impossibly distended, throbbed with its own life. Nurses who helped lift her described the sensation of touching her stomach, as if they were pressing against something that pushed back, pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath their palms. Dr. Margaret Powell, who had practiced obstetrics for over 2 decades, was the attending physician that night. She had delivered children in silence and in screams, in poverty and in calm homes filled with hymns, but nothing had prepared her for the Whittaker family. They clustered in the waiting room with faces pale and eyes unblinking, whispering to each other in a dialect that none of the staff could recognize. Every adult male insisted he was the father. They did not say it with shame, but with the smug certainty of ownership. The birth itself lasted 14 hours. Sarah May never regained consciousness. Her body convulsed so violently that 2 of her ribs cracked under the force of contractions. The fetal monitors, designed to trace the steady rhythm of a baby's heart, displayed patterns that baffled the medical staff. Instead of pulses, the machine traced jagged clusters more like brain waves than any cardiac signature. A nurse swore she heard the monitor whispering, not in words, but in a cadence, like static forming syllables just out of reach. When the child finally emerged, the delivery room froze. What lay on the table could not be described without undoing every assumption the human mind clings to about form and life. Its skull was grotesquely enlarged, skin so translucent the brain itself was visible, and that brain was not singular, but fractured into many pulsing lobes, each beating in discord. Its arms bent at angles that defied anatomy, fingers spiraled into patterns like coiled roots. The legs twisted around one another like living vines, ending not in feet, but in formations resembling tiny faces, each with mouths that opened and closed soundlessly. But the head, if it could be called that, bore the worst revelation. 3 overlapping faces, not fused but stacked and shifting, as if caught between states. They shared eyes, lips, nostrils in grotesque combinations. One face appeared always to be screaming, another weeping, the third fixed in an expression that might have been a smile. The child breathed. It moved. Its many eyes tracked the room independently, watching multiple people at once. The nurses recoiled, some fled. One doctor removed his gloves, walked out of the hospital, and never returned to medicine again. Only Dr. Powell remained steady, her hands trembling but her voice calm, as she ordered it placed in an incubator. She told herself it was science, that she would observe and record. Yet even she later admitted, she felt as though she had trespassed on something sacred and cursed in the same instant. The Whittaker family, when they were permitted to see it, dropped to their knees in reverence. They called it the culmination. The doctors called it a nightmare, and yet it lived. The child was not supposed to survive. Every textbook, every principle of medicine insisted that such deformity could not sustain life. Yet hour by hour it breathed, its chest rising and falling with a rhythm no instrument could measure. It never cried. The sound it made instead was softer, stranger, a low hum that hovered somewhere between electricity and breath, a vibration that unsettled the walls of the room. Nurses spoke of headaches that came only while they were near the incubator. One swore she heard her deceased mother's voice buried inside the static, whispering her name. Dr. Powell documented every anomaly. The child's pupils dilated independently, following multiple movements at once. Its fingers, too many, spiraled in grotesque whorls, flexed in patterns that seemed deliberate, as though attempting to trace symbols in the air. The brain activity registered on machines, not as waves of growth, but as storms. Unpredictable spikes that resembled seizures yet brought no distress. Most chilling of all, when the Whittaker family gathered near the glass, the child grew still, the hum shifting to a lower tone that many described as recognition. The Whittakers stayed in constant vigil. They spoke to it in their dialect, sang in cracked voices, pressed their palms against the incubator glass as though it were sacred. They brought objects from their valley, sticks bound in patterns, stones etched with spirals, faded photographs of other children who had not lived as long. They called it not by a name, but by a phrase, the perfect one. Their eyes shone with a zeal the hospital staff could not meet without shuddering. For 6 days the infant endured. But endurance is not the same as living. Its body began to betray signs of collapse, not in ordinary ways, but in a manner no medical record had prepared for. Its skin, so thin it seemed carved from wax, developed dark patches that shifted across its body as though its insides were dissolving. Yet the child did not appear in pain. On the contrary, its overlapping faces seemed to relax, the twisted mouths easing into something that might have resembled peace. The night before the end, a nurse entered to find the incubator strangely quiet. The child had twisted its malformed limbs into a spiral, an arrangement that defied the very structure of its body. The pattern was geometric, almost deliberate, a perfect circle drawn in flesh. Its 3 faces, for the first time, appeared aligned, each wearing the same faint expression, something like a smile. On the 6th day, as dawn crept into the ward, the hum faded into silence. The child's chest no longer rose. The spiral remained. It had died not in chaos, but in order, as though completing some design no outsider could comprehend. The silence in the hospital was heavier than grief. Even those who had prayed for its release found no comfort. The Whittakers wept softly, but not with despair. Their tears were those of worshippers who had witnessed revelation. To them, the culmination had not failed. It had finished. The morning after the child's death, the hospital shifted from grief to something colder silence enforced by presence. Before the body could be examined, unmarked vehicles arrived, and men in suits stepped through the doors with briefcases and clipped voices. They claimed to be from the Centers for Disease Control, but their questions had nothing to do with infection or quarantine. They asked for every record, every photograph, every personal note written during the 6 days of the child's life. Nurses were required to sign documents they did not understand. Dr. Powell herself was warned that disclosure would constitute a federal crime. The body was removed not on a gurney, but in a black case built for containment, not transport. Even the crude relics the Whittaker family had brought, the bound sticks, the marked stones, the photographs of children long dead, were seized and packed away. The family howled in protest, speaking their dialect with a fury that shook the waiting room, but the suits stood unmoved, their faces expressionless. Sarah May lingered 3 days longer, unconscious, her body poisoned by whatever had grown inside her. When she died, no autopsy was permitted. Her death certificate, signed under pressure, listed the cause simply as multi-organ failure. The Whittakers carried her home to the valley, and after that, the family all but vanished. Their house appeared abandoned to outsiders. Yet hunters claimed to hear voices rising in the woods at night, layered chants that sounded more like mourning than prayer. For the hospital staff, life never returned to normal. Dr. Powell resigned within the year. Nurse Patricia Williams, the one who had heard whispers in the womb during labor, later wrote in a private diary that she could still hear that static hum whenever she tried to sleep. Several staff members relocated out of state. None ever spoke of the Whittakers publicly again. The files, sealed and classified, remained hidden for 50 years. But time erodes secrecy. In 2021, during a wave of automatic declassifications, fragments of the Whittaker case resurfaced in federal archives. Few noticed. Fewer still understood what they were reading. The documents spoke of anomalous genetic presentation, evidence of artificial sequencing, and patterns consistent with intentional design. One phrase was underlined in the final report: multi-generational experiment. What unsettled the researchers, who later reviewed those fragments, was not simply the deformity of the child, but the implication. The Whittakers' incestuous rituals had not been random. Their meticulous journals suggested deliberate cycles, calculated pairings, a breeding program carried out like scripture. And the outcome, Sarah May's child, bore features no mutation should have produced. Its DNA showed structures alien to human biology, sequences that some analysts said looked inserted, as though written. The report ended with a sentence that reads less like bureaucracy and more like prophecy. Further programs of this kind may exist, hidden within other isolated families across the United States. In the years that followed, the Whittaker name slipped into the margins of rumor. The valley where they lived grew over with brush and shadow, the house collapsing inward until it looked less like a home than the ribcage of something long dead. But silence does not erase, it ferments. Local hunters claimed that when fog lay heavy over the trees, they could hear voices in the distance. Voices not quite singing, not quite screaming. Some swore they saw lights weaving through the woods at night, moving in spirals rather than straight lines. A sheriff's deputy who ventured into the hollow in 1978 described a circle of stones arranged around a tree, each stone carved with symbols he had never seen before. His report was filed, then quietly disappeared. By the 1980s, the story might have dissolved into folklore. if not for a single man, Dr. Henry Alcott, a geneticist at a Midwestern university with a fixation on hereditary anomalies. Alcott came across fragments of the Whitaker files while conducting unrelated research. At first, he dismissed them as misfiled case notes until he recognized certain details, sequences of DNA that were marked as impossible, the mention of a child whose brain appeared to function as multiple independent organs. Intrigued, he traveled to Virginia, combing through county archives, census ledgers, and old property deeds. What he uncovered unsettled him. The Whitaker genealogical records did not resemble a family tree at all but a closed circle, generation folding back onto generation until distinctions vanished. Fathers were also uncles, brothers also husbands, cousins also children. The family journals, which he managed to view briefly before they vanished into private hands, revealed a system more exacting than mere incest, deliberate pairings, repeated cycles, a methodical rotation designed to concentrate blood. It read less like depravity than design. Alcott's notes, preserved in a box found after his death in 1992, describe his final discovery. Among the photographs he acquired, there were images of children who bore deformities, so severe they seemed hardly human. Yet some survived long enough to be photographed again years later. Their eyes were pale, their skulls misshapen, their mouths twisted, yet they stared into the camera with an intelligence that unsettled him. One, a boy of perhaps 10, was shown drawing spirals in suit on the wall of a cabin. Another, a girl, held a dead bird in her palm with an expression of fascination rather than grief. Alcott wrote in his journal, "They are not attempting purity. They are attempting completion. The circle is not metaphorical, it is literal." Genetic geometry. 2 weeks after writing that entry, Alcott vanished. His office was cleared by unknown officials. His research assistants questioned and silenced. His family claimed he had suffered a breakdown and wandered away. But those who had seen his notes said otherwise, that he had found something too heavy to carry, something that might explain not only the Whitakers, but a pattern echoing through other forgotten hollers, other names spoken in whispers. After Alcott's disappearance, the trail of the Whitakers might have ended, had it not been for a second anomaly, half a continent away. In 1997, a newborn in a rural Montana hospital survived for only 4 hours, but in that brief span displayed traits eerily similar to the culmination of 1971. Translucent skin, pulses of brain activity too powerful for its fragile body, and most disturbingly, the same spiral pattern drawn with its tiny, distorted limbs before death. The event was never reported publicly, yet a handful of doctors who had once studied the Whitaker files recognized the pattern instantly. What unsettled them most was geography. The family name attached to the child was not Whitaker. It was something else, a lineage with no apparent ties to Appalachia. And yet, when genealogists quietly traced the line back, they found a faint blood connection, a single Whitaker woman who had drifted westward in 1912, vanishing from her valley and marrying under a different name. The blood had spread quietly, invisibly, into new soil. By the early 2000s, whispers spread through circles of genetic researchers who traded in restricted archives. They spoke of what they called the program, though no one could prove whether it was orchestrated or accidental. The evidence suggested more than chance, scattered families in isolated pockets of the country, all carrying faintly mirrored rituals of bloodline preservation. Each claimed secrecy, each spoke of keeping the circle unbroken, and in every case, children born of their unions showed the same haunting anomalies, short lives, spiral markings. brains that defied structure. Some researchers believed the Whitakers were not an aberration, but a template. That whatever had taken root in their valley a century ago had spread outward like a disease, disguised as devotion. In 2008, one file surfaced briefly before vanishing again. It described a case in North Carolina where twins were delivered under government supervision. The twins lived longer than any previous instance, 12 days. On the 12th night, both ceased breathing within seconds of each other. The attending nurse claimed that in their final hour, the twins turned their heads simultaneously toward a blank wall, staring at a point where no stimulus existed, their small mouths forming identical shapes, a perfect circle. The file ended with a note scrawled in the margin, "By an unknown hand, completion is approaching." By then, rumors had leaked beyond medical circles. Journalists chasing rural mysteries stumbled onto fragments. Birth records sealed too quickly, census gaps, families that vanished from one generation to the next. And always, in the shadows of these accounts, the echo of the Whitaker name. It was no longer a single family. It was a pattern, a network, a lineage threading through forgotten corners of America, hidden in plain sight. By the second decade of the 21st century, the Whitakers had become less a family than a specter, a word passed in hushed tones by archivists, geneticists, and the few journalists reckless enough to chase their trail. Yet the story never reached the surface. Files disappeared, testimonies retracted, and those who pressed too far either vanished or recanted. What survived were fragments, a whisper here, a misplaced report there, letters pulled from basements long after their writers were gone. One such letter, dated 2015, came from a nurse in rural Kentucky. She wrote of a child born without eyes, who nevertheless followed movement across the room, tilting its head as though perceiving what no one else could. The infant lasted 3 days, and when it died its tiny hands had twisted inward to form the unmistakable spiral. It was not a deformity, the nurse insisted. It was intention. The letter was mailed to a university researcher, but the recipient claimed he never received it. Months later, the nurse herself was found drowned in a shallow creek. The death was ruled accidental. By 2020, the spiral began to appear beyond medical reports. Graffiti in abandoned towns, carved into tree bark near derelict farmhouses, etched into the foundations of schools that had long since closed. In every case, the marks were fresh, not the relics of forgotten mischief, but symbols maintained, tended, renewed. Hunters spoke of hearing choruses in the woods, layered voices chanting syllables that made their teeth ache. In one county, livestock were found arranged in circles, their bodies untouched by predators. No tracks led to or from the site. And then came the fragment released in 2021 during the sweep of declassification. The final page of the Whitaker file, previously withheld. It was not a report, but a transcript. The last words of Sarah Mae Whitaker, recorded in the hospital the night before her death. She had surfaced briefly from her coma, speaking in a voice so weak it barely registered on the machine. Yet her words were clear. It is not ours. It only borrows us. The circle is not finished. When the blood is ready, it will step through. The tape ends there. What remains is not proof, but a pattern etched in bloodlines, in hidden valleys, in the spirals that reappear wherever silence is deepest. A pattern suggesting that the Whitakers were not breeding toward madness, but toward design. Something deliberate, something waiting. And if the whispers are true, if the blood has indeed seeped outward across generations, then the circle has already widened beyond Appalachia, perhaps into towns you know, perhaps into families you trust. perhaps into you. The Whitakers vanish not with a scream, but with a murmur. No great fire consumes their valley. No catastrophe erases their name. They dissolve into the folds of time like breath into fog, leaving only fragments. Journals that refuse to decay, symbols carved into stone, government files that appear and disappear like echoes. Their house collapses inward, its timbers rotting into the soil, yet hunters claim the air within its ruins is colder, as though the walls remember. Those who have studied the story will tell you the Whitakers were an anomaly, a grotesque accident of inbreeding, nothing more. But the fragments disagree. The journals whisper of cycles. The children's bodies formed deliberate patterns. The voices recorded spoke of completion. None of this aligns with chance. And perhaps that is why their tale endures. Because in the end, it was never about the Whitakers alone. They were the visible fracture, the wound on the surface. Beneath them stretched something larger, a network of hidden bloodlines, old rituals passed in silence, families guarding secrets too heavy for words. The spiral turns outward, patient, inexorable. The last government report did not ask whether the cycle had ended. It asked where else it might continue. And so the story remains unfinished. Perhaps the culmination was a failure. Or perhaps it was only the first whisper of a design too vast for one generation to bear. Perhaps the blood has already spread further than any record can follow. Perhaps the spiral is waiting, quietly. In some child yet unborn, the Whitakers are gone. But the circle has not closed. And if the pattern is true, if the blood truly seeks its completion, then the next valley, the next family, the next birth may already be chosen, not by chance, not by God, by design.